Um, I'll probably just make a quick introduction and then pass it on to Martin and then pass it on to other colleagues who are here today to talk about business rates and anything related. It feels some time since we last got together. At least I don't remember the last time we met. But for those who don't know, the Collection Fund Network probably started just straight after when the rates retention system came into place back in 2013. I think we might have set up the group in 2014. At the time, it was kind of more district councils trying to understand how the system works, and there was a lot going on. And I think we needed a group to try and kind of put the heads together to make sense of rates retention system. And I think since then it has been really helpful, and it's become like a more of a national group trying to bring experts together, make sense of the system, try and understand what the finances, so the numbers mean for each council. And I think over the years, I think we did an excellent job, and I think we set it up at the right time to kind of help councils across the country. I think the numbers grew over the years. I think for the last few years, we haven't been as active as we used to be. But now that we've got all the changes that's come through over the last year, the kind of business rates reset, the kind of the changes in NNGR1, the new multipliers, we felt like it's necessary that we come together again with all the changes and talk about business rates retention system, what the future looks like, what the numbers look like for us, what the technical changes looks like. And what we normally do is have kind of experts in the field present on the day, kind of talk about the latest development, and then have a Q&A session at the end. And as you can see, the numbers, we've got loads of people today, and it's kind of really great to see. And so hopefully it will be a good session. And I think in the past we had these sessions once every 6 months. Whether we can make sure we stick to that or we have it once every quarter, it's something that we'll probably need to discuss. But I won't say any more. Just want to say thank you for attending, and hopefully you find this session useful. And I'll pass it on to Martin.
Yes, thank you, Chardash. So firstly, I think I just wanted to say thank you to Chardash for originally setting up the group about a decade ago. I mean, obviously, it's become a very useful network for revenue specialists and collection fund accountants and people working in business rates retention more generally sort of come together and, share understanding about things that they're working on and the issues and challenges they're facing. And obviously we're about to enter into a period of now significant change in relation to the business rates retention system. So it's very much focused on the planning and preparation, and now we're very much moving into the implementation stage. So I just again want to say thanks to Chardash for setting up the group in the first place. So moving on to the agenda for the day. So you've seen from the agenda we have 4 presentations. So we'll be starting off with Adrian Jenkins from Pixel. We'll be discussing local government finance settlement, the fair funding review outcomes and the wider implications, and then we'll hand over to LG Futures colleagues who will provide an update on the NNGR1, which is due to sort of 2 weeks today, so not long now, and then some of the wider weights retention issues and interactions that are arising from the changes. Then we'll have a short break at about 11:10 for about 5 minutes. Then Mark Catlow from LGF Technical will provide an update and overview on some of the technical changes arising in rates retention, including the new business rates baselines, the revaluation impacts, and the impact on certain key issues like designated areas. And then we'll also have an update from John Ballantyne on behalf of the LGA. And then for the last 20 minutes or so, around sort of 12 o'clock, we'll have a short opportunity for Q&A for people to ask questions on any relevant issues, either sort of through the chat or people want to go on camera face to face. But obviously, if you're not comfortable about doing that, quite happy for you to send an email to Olivia afterwards, and we can try and answer your questions through the network and colleagues. So that's very much the format and the agenda for the day. So I'll start over by handing over to Adrian from Pixel for the first presentation.
That's great. Thank you, Martin. I mean, my session is focusing principally on the provisional local government finance settlement from last month, but also looking a bit further ahead to the final settlement, which we're expecting at the beginning of next month. So I mean, I think we were just discussing before the start of this, just the sheer amount of stuff that's happened over the last well, particularly the last few months, but over the last year, has been such a lot of change. A huge change in distribution of funding, a huge range of other changes as well around business rates too. So a huge amount of things happening. So we'll just start off by looking at what's happened in that provisional local government finance settlement. So a bit of context to the first session, at least this morning, but also I guess more broadly about where all the business rates changes fit into the wider settlement that's happened. We'll look a little bit at the responses that councils and representative groups have made and the lobbying points that have emerged from that. And then very briefly for me, we'll look at some of the budget setting issues connected particularly with business rates and some issues that have arisen with our MTFP model and questions that we have from councils. But I'll leave the real detail about implementing NNDR1 and the business rates budgeting side of things to Caroline, Chris and Mark later in the session. So timescale and questions. The first thing to mention is that the consultation response was, the deadline for that was the 14th of January, so it's just gone. So if you did get a response in, well done. It's always worth putting something in just to put a marker down, make your points and support the things that you want to support. 4 weeks as a consultation period is nowhere near enough, particularly when there's such a lot of change, and also it's the first time that authorities will have seen official numbers and exemplification. So, and also given that 2 weeks of that was taken up with Christmas and New Year, really difficult for councils to unpick what's happened, to understand what the budgeting means from that, and also to make a representation back to government. Really tricky. An awful lot of pressure on the councils to do all that. But now really we're looking ahead to the final settlement. Can you expect any change in that final settlement? Well, I really hope not. I really hope that nothing has to change in terms of financial planning and budgeting. And actually, it's very unlikely that anyone does get anything different in the final settlement. And I've never known councils really get any less in the final than in the provisional. Ministers don't like taking money away from people between the provisional and the final. So if action is going to be taken, it tends to be about putting more money in, not taking money away from councils. Looking back into previous kind of major settlements that we've had, 13, 14, there was additional rural funding following a kind of an uprising of rural MPs. Although Stuart Hoggan tells me it's actually 14, 15, but I can't quite remember. It's that sort of time there was an additional amount of money for rural authorities that became the Rural Services Delivery Grant. Then in 2016-17, a big uprising of county MPs, resulting in the transition grant for county authorities for 2 years to help with the transition during that period. But in neither of those cases was there much money. But it's always additional money, so Treasury coming forward with additional funds or the department finding funds from within its own reserves. And it does need a real groundswell of MPs to make something happen, for ministers to really sit up and think that they might lose the vote in Parliament on the final settlement. At this point in time, I'm not aware of any real groundswell or uprising of MPs, but you never know. These things do tend to happen quite quickly. They almost come, these squalls kind of blow up out of nowhere. So it's not for certain that nothing will happen before the final settlement. Just looking at some of the overall context to what's happened, the winning areas are very definitely Outer London and many metropolitan authorities. So you've got Outer London increasing by 23.7%, the Mets on average 19.1%, a good deal above the upper tier and the England averages of 16.2% and 15.3%. So very much gone to Outer London and lots of the Mets, and as well to some unitary authorities. I think Luton of upper tier authorities had the biggest increase in funding over the next 3 years. For Met authorities, it's broadly positive and good at the top end. So places like Birmingham in particular doing particularly well from the changes, but there is a surprising number of metropolitan authorities with low increases in funding. Some of those have been helped by the recovery grant guarantee, places like Rochdale or South Tyneside, but others have very definitely been left out and are feeling quite sore about that, places like Trafford and Stockport. I'll just give you a link there to a New Statesman article from before December to illustrate that there could be some MPs for those kinds of areas, Labour MPs, who will potentially put pressure on ministers to make some changes. In London, there are always expectations of a reduction in funding, and there's not really much scope for those authorities to make much of a challenge. We'll look at that in quite a lot of detail in the next few slides. And within Inner London, there's the 6 or 5 Inner London boroughs who are challenging the £150 Band D increase that's gone into that's been offset against their funding floor increases Windsor and Maidenhead being the sixth. Challenging that's unreasonable, it's arbitrary. There's also a very clear rural-urban split, bigger increases in urban areas than rural areas, and a very clear shift away from rural authorities by the change as a result of the changes in remoteness. And some rural unitaries like Westland and Furness losing really quite heavily compared to what we're expecting in the summer. Districts are a very mixed group. Some urban districts with temporary accommodation doing really well. Some high growth districts with pools doing exceptionally well, even though you wouldn't quite see it from the settlement figures themselves. Others not so much, kind of caught betwixt and between. And fire, an improved outcome compared to what we're thinking about in the summer, with the real terms floor really helping, certainly helping, I think, a handful of fire authorities and boosting the average increase for fire. So before we go and look at some of the analysis about what's happened at authority level, just to start off with looking at some of the issues that I know are being raised with ministers and being raised with MPs and by MPs. So the removal of remoteness from the area cost adjustment is probably the top one that I've seen from the rural side. Second homes premium not being adjusted for in the tax base is really important too. The continuation of recovery grant. Obviously, those who get the recovery grant are very pleased about that, but others who don't are probably pushing back on that. A lot of county authorities mentioning that the reliance on council tax and cost spending power is unfair, and I think also complaining about the split of the rolled in business rate pooling gains between districts and counties as well. I know some authorities, places like Lambeth, Islington, South Tyneside, complaining about the interaction between the 100% funding floor and the recovery grant guarantee, and particularly the removal, or lobbying for the removal of that 35 million pound cap on the recovery grant. Also some issues around some of the split unitaries, Northants and Cumbria, about whether particularly the children's formula is working properly in those areas. But really, in the end, it's will any of these issues get traction with ministers? And what are the numbers of MPs that are fighting for these changes? Will any of these issues have to be addressed in the final settlement? I mean, I think some will. I think the second homes premium issue does need to be addressed. I think that's just a straightforward error. Although whether it was known before the provisional settlement or not, I just don't know. But really, it's whether there are any technical issues here as well, whether there are any corrections that need to be made to the settlement, and also whether ministers start to get worried about any future risk of future legal challenge. That's always the thing that will be of concern to officials. Does this end up going to judicial review? And I'm not aware of any authorities that are thinking of doing that, but I think there are one or two issues where there might be some grounds if an authority wants to pursue it. Then very briefly looking at the change in core spending power without council tax. As I mentioned, for quite a lot of county authorities, this has been quite a big deal. Looking at the extent to which in county areas their increase in core spending power is largely or entirely reliant on increases in council tax. Other parts of the country, the mix between grants and council tax is very different. So out of London, Met authorities, more than half of their increase in core spending power comes from grants. But that's just how the system works. But clearly that's one thing that some types of authority will want to push back on. So a set of slides now where we look at sort of scatter plots, really looking at first of all, looking at the core spending power per head. This is for upper tier authorities compared to IMD. I said it's 2025 IMD, but I think I might have made an error and pulled through the 2019. But I think that the points probably still stand. So what I wanted to start off by saying is this shows a really strong correlation between the core spending power per head and IMD scores. And I guess it's partly what you'd expect. A lot of the formulas within the settlement are driven by deprivation type factors. And also ministers have been very clear that they wanted to make sure that the changes they made in the fair funding review are very much driven by deprivation. They feel that what's happened over the last 14 years with Conservative-led governments is that shifted away from deprivation. So it's very much a shift back towards deprivation. I think if you've seen Dan Bates's analysis in previous webinars, you'll see that correlation has gone up quite considerably from where it was in 2025 to where it is now. So just picking some groups within there, you can see there at the bottom end of that distribution, those authorities with the lowest IMDs have got the lowest amounts of core spending power per head, places like Richmond, Wokingham, Surrey, Windsor and Maidenhead. At the other end of the scale, you've got those authorities with the highest IMD scores having the greatest amounts of core spending power per head. But what is interesting is that there are some quite big differences there in core spending power per head with authorities that have got very similar levels of IMD. So if you compare, say, Middlesbrough with Kingston upon Hull, quite different levels of core spending power per head for authorities with similar levels of IMD. So it's not just as simple as saying that your IMD dictates what you're going to get from core spending power per head. It's worth picking out London as well, in London in particular. So you can see there the places like Tower Hamlets, Hackney, Camden, for instance, K&C as well. Those are a lot of those in London boroughs there, even though they've done very badly from this fair funding review, are still getting a higher level of core spending power per head than just their IMD would suggest. So that's because of the things that are happening within the settlement, and it's not just about IMD. But also, I think there's still some hangover of high levels of funding from other funding sources, and particularly from things like temporary accommodation. You also see Port Wandsworth really dropped off the scale here based on our measures here. So it's way below where you'd expect Wandsworth to be for core spending power per head compared to its IMD score. And in fact, it's lower than, in fact, any other authority in terms of CSP per head. Then looking at district councils, you can see there the R squared is much, much lower than it was for upper tier authorities. And that's because there are some other factors that are much more important in driving the distribution of core spending power per head. So we start off looking at some of the those authorities, those district councils with the highest levels of IMD. And again, you'll see here some very, very different amounts of funding per head. Great Yarmouth, for instance, very high levels of IMD and much lower levels of core spending power per head than other places with similar or even lower levels of IMD like Preston, Thanet or Hastings, for instance. And that really is because some of those authorities like Preston and Hastings in particular are getting a lot of temporary accommodation or TARNF per head, which results in a higher level of core spending power per head than somewhere like Great Yarmouth or even Hyndburn or Burnley, for instance. So quite a lot of difference there in terms of very deprived authorities. I think it's quite a key feature of this settlement and also previous settlements that there are some very high need authorities, district councils, who've done very badly from the settlement now and in the past as well. And Great Yarmouth is probably at the head of that list. Then you've got authorities that you would expect to have lower levels of core spending power per head because they've got much lower levels of deprivation, Vale of Whitehorse, South Oxfordshire, etc. But then you've got this very strange group at the top here who've got some very, very high levels of core spending power that's clearly not linked to IMD. Northwest Leicestershire being the top of that group, but also places like Harborough, North Warwickshire as well. These are district councils who've had a really significant boost in core spending power because of the way that business rate growth has been rolled in, and particularly because the business rate pool growth has all been allocated to district councils. And then I think some of those other councils, very urban district councils like Oxford, Ipswich, Preston as well, I think places that have probably got very high levels of temporary accommodation RNF as a result of that new relative needs formula that's been introduced. And I think that probably favours some of those very urban shire district councils. There are others in that group as well. We just picked out some of the ones at the top end of that distribution. Here I've compared changes in core spending power, so it's changed in core spending power over the 3-year period against the ratio of council tax to core spending power. Before the settlement, or certainly before the summer, we thought that the ratio of council tax to overall resources would be the key driver. In other words, that council tax equalisation would be the principal driver in terms of the changes in distribution of funding over the next 3 years. But you can see here that the R squared is not particularly high, only 0.2. It's not particularly strong. I think there have been other changes that actually have been at least, if not more important than equalisation. So changes in some of the formulas have been particularly important. So you can see that some of the councils that have got a much higher change in core spending power, that's just not particularly necessarily just driven by. Also, I started up here. I look at some of the authorities, these the black circles here. These are sort of mostly metropolitan councils whose increase in core spending power has been less significant than I would have expected. Places like Knowsley in particular, but also some high need unitaries like Blackpool as well. Some of those councils there, very low level, relatively low levels of council tax compared to core spending power, and not getting particularly large increases in core spending power over the next 3 years. Then there's some real outliers here, places that have really lost out very significantly from the changes in fair funding. Lots of them, particularly in the London boroughs, K and C, Wandsworth, Westminster, Camden in particular. So even though we're seeing that they've got core spending power that's higher than we might have expected, relative to just IMD, we're also seeing these councils losing quite significantly compared to what they've currently got. And then this group I was mentioning right at the beginning, some authorities here doing particularly well. And I think you see a lot of out on the boroughs there, as you'd expect, Barking and Dagenham, Hounslow, for instance. Also some Met authorities like Birmingham, but also particularly you see their Luton Unitary Authority getting the biggest increase in core spending power over the next 3 years. And then some real outliers there, but places that we would have expected to see because they've got very high levels of council tax base compared to the core spending power. So they're the authorities that we would normally expect to lose quite significantly from the council tax equalisation. And I'm not quite sure they have lost quite as much as I thought they would have done. I thought council tax equalisation would have been more powerful in terms of redistribution. I'm not quite sure that it has. I mean, they've clearly done less well than most of the types of authority. Surrey, Richmond, Windsor and Maidenhead Woking way down in terms of having some of the lowest increases in funding over the next 3 years, but I don't think they've done quite as badly as I thought they may have done compared to our pre-summer forecasts. So now looking at some of the key issues that have come through and that I know councils are pursuing. First of all, we mentioned remoteness. This was, I think, a surprising change in the provisional settlement. We thought that remoteness was something that it was announced that it would be in every single relative needs formula within the ACA, within every RNF in the new settlement, but it's been removed from every one of the ACAs apart from adult social care. Government said in the summer that there was a compelling theoretical case for including this adjustment. So it was the MHCLG's own research that was supporting the case for including remoteness within the area cost adjustment, but they decided based on the fact that there was not enough evidence from, or really case study evidence from authorities to support a weighting in any of the ACAs apart from adult social care. And I think that's a little bit of a cop-out. I think that MHCLG should have produced their own evidence. They should have used some of that case study evidence to bolster that rather than just say we didn't get enough evidence. I'm just not quite sure how strong that is. And I think given that MHCLG did their own research to show there was a compelling theoretical case, I would have expected remoteness to have continued in every one of the RNFs, even if it was given a much lower weighting than they'd originally had in the summer. So I think this is an area where, and I know MPs will be pushing ministers to reveal more information about the research that was done within the department and the basis for the decision to remove remoteness. And potentially that's an area where there could be a case for a legal challenge if an authority was minded to do so. Some of the changes are really quite significant. So for Cornwall, I think they've lost potentially around 57 million as a result of the changes in just the remoteness adjustment. So it's not a small change. It's really quite a big a change with quite a big impact. The continuation of recovery grant. This is a grant that was introduced in the current financial year to get councils back on their feet. It's meant to be a one-off grant. There's a case for continuing it. It delivers an overall outcome that, where core spending power per head is better correlated with deprivation, and we've seen that in some of those earlier charts. You know, there is a stronger correlation now between deprivation and CSP per head, and I think that's a reasonable political argument for ministers to make. And I think I'm not quite sure they've made that particularly well, but I think there is quite a strong case for that. That if ministers want deprivation to be a bigger driver, then that's what they've got, and continuing recovery grant will help to do that. It is based on an assessment of need. It uses, even if it doesn't use, it uses a recent IMD. It uses the 2019 index of multiple deprivation, but I think there's a strong argument they could have done something better here to fund these authorities with higher levels of deprivation. And the case against is that it was the whole purpose of the fair funding review was to replace ad hoc funding and to use evidence-based approach and to at least use the most recent methodology. They could have at least updated IMD for the 2025 IMD. Then this issue about rolling in business rates income, the income that's been rolled in mostly has been reasonably calculated, but there is an issue here about that pooling gains have also been rolled in, which I think is fair enough. That was a reasonable decision to make, but those gains have been distributed entirely to the tariff authority members of those pools. So in other words, they've just reduced the levy payments that those authorities would have made in the 50% scheme and allocated all the pool gains to tariff authorities, principally to Shire District Council. So that means that the percentage of growth that's rolled into core spending power is so much greater for Shire districts than anybody else. So it's unfair in terms of that currently in the reality, pooling gains are shared between county councils, Shire District Councils, also fire authorities in some cases, and also shared into a general investment pot. So clearly, I think that's quite the rationale. I don't understand what that was. I'm not sure whether it was fully thought through, but it has created what you might call quite a dysfunctional system with some of those authorities, like we saw North West Leicestershire, Harborough, North Warwickshire, being way above where you'd expect them to be in terms of core spending power per head. So not a good decision. And I know there's been quite a lot of pushback, not just from councils and MPs, but I know from technical advisors as well. It's a very strange decision, but one I don't think will be reversed. I think officials are pretty committed to it. I can't see them changing that decision in the final settlement. So if you're one of those boroughs of one of those Shire districts who's gained significantly from this, I think it's there to stay. Second homes tax-based projections are clearly wrong in that they have not been adjusted for the second homes premium that was introduced in April 2025. So the tax-based projections that are being used to calculate the funding floors, that's not being used in the resource adjustment within the fair funding assessment. It's just being used to calculate funding floors and to show increases in core spending power over the next 3 years. Government's used the 4-year change in tax base, but they have not adjusted for the introduction of those second homes premiums in 2025. That's clearly wrong. It overstates the growth in tax base over the next 3 years. For most councils, it's just a presentational issue. It just overstates the core spending power increase over the next 3 years. And clearly you want that to be as accurate as possible. But it does affect the funding floor payments for those authorities who are below the funding floor threshold. These are mostly in the London boroughs, but also some Shire districts as well. And I think there's only one upper tier authority who would be dragged below the funding floor threshold, that's West London Finesse, if the tax base was correctly calculated. So I think my guess is they will have to change the way they calculated the tax base projections. I think it's just wrong not to have adjusted for second homes, but it could be expensive. It could cost a couple $100 million to put that right. And there would then be a question about whether they would just find additional money, use their own reserves, or have to scale everyone else back. But the pressures are particularly strong, I think, in inner London. And you see here, those authorities whose second homes, the tax base has been the most overstated by not adjusting for second homes, are places like City of London, Westminster, K&C, Tower Hamlets. But then you see quite a few more rural authorities, more county authorities that have got a lot of, I guess, more tourist trade, more second homes, places like Cornwall, Isle of Wight, Westmoreland, etc., etc. Similar sort of pattern in Shire districts, in that you've got places like North Norfolk, South Hams, places that have got a lot of tourist industry and a lot of second homes. Their growth in tax base is quite significantly overstated as a result of not adjusting for the second homes premium. I think some councils are pushing back, saying the funding floor costs are really quite significant, and they are. They are 1.2 billion over the next 3 years, and they rise from 295 million in year 1 to 547 million in year 3. So the growth, they actually grow in value over the next 3 years. So it's the opposite of phasing out the funding floors. Roughly, I think that if they properly adjusted the tax base growth, I think that would cost about 130 million over the next 3 years. So it's a bit less than I initially thought, but it's still not nothing. So that money would need to be found. And by year 3, I think that's an extra 50 million pounds going into inner London. I think it's also important to acknowledge there's a significant cliff edge in 28-29 that's been unresolved. And the government said, you know, we're concerned about the cliff edge. We propose moving authorities to their funding target over the next 3 years. But clearly that's not happened for shire districts and in London boroughs. There's a lot of funding floor allocation that's still in the system in 28-29. And as we've seen, those allocations going up over the next 3 years. I don't think there's any real chance of shifting those authorities to their funding target in the foreseeable future. And what government's effectively said is that, you know, we acknowledge there's a cliff edge and it's a problem, but we're not going to do anything about it. So that's one of those sort of issues that's just hanging in midair. Very quickly, just to mention, we will be updating our local government reorganisation model, firstly for the final settlement, and then I think in more depth in the spring for all the consolidated grants, the rolling grants, and all the new R&Fs as well. Firstly to support the latest round of business cases, and then to support authorities with implementation. In terms of outstanding provisional final settlement issues, will there be revisions to the settlement? I think there possibly will be for second homes, as I've mentioned. There was an issue about population in that the population figures that are given in the core spending power table, we've found out, Dan Bates has found out that they're based on the 2018 based population projections. They should be based on the 2022 based population projections. As far as we know, that's just an issue in terms of presentation, but it does worry me that that data set that we've seen publicly is incorrect, and I wonder whether there are errors within the rest of the formula. I suspect not, but it's just a worry that we'll need to keep an eye on. We're expecting a distribution from the levy account surplus, the surplus from the levy account. I think last year it was 100 million. I think the last few years have been 100 million, and yeah, our modelling is suggesting the same amount, but we need to know exactly what's available for distribution. We're also awaiting the distribution of the internal drainage boards, £5 million again in 26-27, and then a new funding model from 27-28. And we will be working over the next few weeks in advance of the final settlement, just making sure that we can fully reconcile all the legacy grants and rolled in grants, and also the calculation of all the consolidated grants. Some of the visibility from government in the settlement on these grants was quite poor, so understanding exactly what's in them and how they've been calculated is still something that we're working on. Then finally, just an issue about the budgeting for business rates. First issue is about some of the impact on actual funding allocations especially for shire district councils, as a result of the way that the business rate pooling gains have been rolled into the baseline in 25-26. So in our model, we have never included the impact of business rate pools in their model. So if you're an authority that's gained substantially from the roll-in of business rate pooling gains, you will see, as you see on the right hand side here, that you'll see potentially a big uplift in funding in 26-27. So for this authority here that I was talking to yesterday, you know, their settlement outcome has been very flat. They lost quite significantly as a result of the reset, but their baseline was so increased as a result of the pooling gain roll-in that actually their funding has actually increased quite significantly in 26-27, even though the settlement shows them as being below the funding floor, at least in year one. So just to be aware of that, there's quite an odd transition there for those shire district councils who have gained significantly from the roll-in of the business rate pools. You'll see quite an uplift in 26-27, and then kind of a flatter position over years 2 and 3. And also just to be aware as well that in our modelling we have updated for the new business rate baseline and the new top-ups and tariffs, but we've also forecast business rate income based on the latest rateable values and small and standard multipliers from the VOA. So if you look at cell AB7 in the BRS tab, you'll see there that we've got a forecast for what we think your gross rates is based on the latest RV and multipliers. Clearly, you'll need to overwrite that with whatever comes out of the NNDR1. And you may find that you are above or below baseline in our modelling. I think a lot of the reason for that is that the assumption for appeals within the business rate baseline is 3.75%. We're carrying over your assumption from 25-26 and NDR1, and it's very likely that the amount that you had in that NNDR1 is just different from the 3.75, and that's resulting in most councils being slightly above baseline, but some slightly below. And clearly, when you update for NNDR1, that will change the outcome of that forecasting. Okay, so it's a bit of a rattle through what we've got there. I think I'll hand back to Martin.
Yeah, thanks very much, Adrian, for that very helpful and comprehensive analysis of the settlement. And obviously it highlights, there's an awful lot of work that has gone into this from local authority colleagues and MHCLG to make this work. But obviously we now, as I've said, sort of moving into the implementation phase, and obviously we'll see what the implications are of any changes in the final settlement, and obviously recognising that due to the transitional arrangements, it's very much an ongoing process. So they'll need to be relooking at things again very soon for 29-30 onwards. So in terms of the sort of the process, I mean, I think we won't be taking questions at this stage, but obviously feel free to put any questions you have in the chat, and then we can pick them up as part of the more general discussion at about 12 o'clock after the presentations are finished. So I'll now hand over to Caroline and colleagues from LG Future and Chris as well to pick up their presentation, which focused on NNDR1s and other changes to the business rates retention system from 26-27 onwards.
Thanks, Martin. I think it's just me at the moment. Chris may appear. Morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting us along once again. Yes, I'm going to focus mainly on the NNDR1. January is obviously all about the statutory declarations for both council tax. Obviously, yesterday was the 15th in terms of your council tax estimated surplus deficit declaration. Hopefully that has been done. And obviously business rates, we're quickly heading towards that 31st of January deadline. So just a reminder there in terms of the support LG Futures can provide. Accounting, obviously, 25-26, as we mentioned earlier. Hopefully year-end 25-26 will be very similar to 24-25, and then we'll deal with the changes to 26-27 after that. Module 2, our monitoring model, obviously there to support your declarations for council tax and for business rates. And Module 3, reviews of NNDR1 forms when they are completed. Just a reminder, if you haven't booked your meeting yet, if you're due to have that provided by us, please do. We've got about 130 to get through in the next 2 weeks. And for anybody out there struggling with completing their NNDR1, we know there are issues with revenues systems being updated. We have put together an estimation service for completing that NNDR1. So we would hope that nobody would need to ask for an extension from CLG, that we can get all of those in by the deadline. But do get in touch if you need help with that. In terms of the changes for 26-27 that are impacting on the NNDR1 and the system updates, obviously we've got the supporting small business rates relief scheme, the new one for 2026, as well as another year's extension on the 23 scheme. We've got the new transitional relief scheme, as well as the new transitional surcharge that we've got coming in, that extra 1p on the multipliers where relevant. We've got an extension to the second property small business rates relief from 1 year to 3 years. Obviously at the budget we had the announcement around the electric vehicle relief that isn't on the NNDR1 form, you may have noticed, because the details haven't been confirmed yet, but we do expect that come on stream during the year. So obviously there will be some implications for authorities in terms of cash flow, but we are expecting it to be Section 31 funded. And obviously in the press, we've had rumblings about additional support for pubs, whether that takes the form of a new relief for pubs, or whether, oh, sorry, my slide's not sharing. Thank you, Chris.
Sorry, Caroline. Yeah, they're not moving. So.
Right, okay, I had that issue yesterday. Sorry. So the new pub relief could be a relief. We've heard rumblings it might be a change to the multiplier, but we'll obviously have to wait and see in terms of what that will mean. Next slide, please, Chris. In terms of the multiplier changes, obviously we've got new multipliers for 26-27. Starting with the multipliers for 25-26, obviously they will be adjusted for revaluation. That's also coming into play. So whatever the rateable value goes up by nationally, we see an offsetting reduction in the multiplier to ensure that it's fiscally neutral. So the 19.6% increase in RV obviously reduces the multipliers by the same amount. We then get an amount built into the multipliers by government for appeals. So what we expect to reduce lose income for over the period will get added to the multiplier in the first place. So we've got it there to give back. So that's 3.75% increase. And then obviously the usual inflationary increase, which was 3.8%, taking us to the new standard multiplier of 48p and the new small multiplier of 43.2p. Just to mention as well, any authorities obviously with designated areas as well, because of revaluation 26, you'll need to recalculate your baselines for the NNDR1 form for the Part 3DA in there as well and complete that. Next slide, please, Chris. In terms of the new multipliers, obviously we've got new amounts for the small and standard, but we've also got the 3 additional multipliers coming in for 26-27. So the 2 new retail, hospitality and leisure multipliers, 5p lower than the normal small and standard, and the higher value multiplier at 2.8p higher than the standard multiplier for those properties with an RV of $500,000 or more. In terms of allocating properties to those RHL multipliers, it's for authorities to make the decision around that in line with the RHL regulations, which define qualifying RHL hereditaments as being those used wholly or mainly for the purposes, for qualifying purposes, and also the RHL guidance alongside that. So the regulations helpfully gives us a list of properties that don't meet the definition, so we've got some exemptions as it were in there, and whereas the guidance gives us a non-exhaustive list of hereditaments that could fall within the guidance, but it is supposed to be pretty similar to the 40% relief application that we had for 25-26, and we've just got a pretty little picture on there in terms of you're going to have to allocate between the 5 multipliers on your NNDR1 form, and we can look at that in terms of the RHL compared to the VOA data that obviously allocates by category. Thank you, Chris. So in terms of what you'll need to do on your NNDR1 form to get it to be able to produce the relevant information, obviously you'll need to load the new 26 valuations, set up for the new schemes in accordance with the new guidance for transition and supporting small business, and ensure that each of the hereditaments is allocated to the relevant multipliers, which will obviously mean doing that for the new RHL multipliers, determining which ones meet the definition of flagging those on the system. And as I already mentioned, we know that authorities are having issues with systems, getting them updated, getting the information loaded on. And as I've already mentioned, we have got an approach available to support you with that if you need around an estimates approach so you can meet the deadlines. So we're going to be using the 26 rating list data, calculating the schemes on the new guidance for transition and supporting small business, and then using estimates on published data to complete the rest of the form. So do get in touch if that would be helpful for you. Thank you, Chris. In terms of completing the form for the new multipliers, you may have noticed that there are 5 boxes now for allocating rateable value. On there, each of those multipliers, you have to allocate the rateable value against it, split between billing authority area and designated area if relevant, and the form will then calculate the gross rates from each of those multiplier amounts. And as usual, there are the estimated growth and decline lines to be filled in to make sure we get the most accurate calculation for 26-27 based on local knowledge. Thank you, Chris. In terms of the new multipliers, it's intended to be revenue neutral for authorities. So we've got a supplement and discount approach, as the government are calling it, whereby they will adjust any additional amounts you collect from the higher value multiplier or amounts that you are losing from using the RHL lower multipliers. They will adjust your income back to where it would have been using the small and standard multipliers as they are, using Section 31 grant, but in an approach similar to the transitional protection payment. So any additional income from the higher value multiplier will first be used to cover the cost of losses from the RHL multipliers, and then there will be a Section 31 grant settlement either way for the difference. In terms of the form, thankfully, government have simplified it. When they first started talking to us about what the new multipliers might mean for the layout of the NNDR1, we were talking about 20 plus columns in terms of adding new columns for each of the multipliers. Thankfully, we sort of hopefully managed to talk them down on that one, and you'll see that we have now got rid of even the split between the small and standard multipliers vertically on part 2 of the form. We've now just got these additional lines, a bit like we had with the old additional yield lines, to deal with the new multipliers. So that makes it much simpler in terms of working with the form, given that they took that forward. Thank you, Chris. Obviously, another change for 26-27 is that government have decided to take on the risk of mandatory reliefs for 26-27. So obviously, government have always been reviewing risk and reward in the system. Initially, obviously, authorities had the risk of movement in mandatory reliefs compared to the amounts that were taken into the baseline set in 2013-14. Obviously, reliefs could change over the last 10 years as a result of changes in tax base or changes in reliefs or changes in level of collection. We think authorities have obviously dealt with these changes very well. They've done lots to obviously take this on board around collection work, verifying reliefs are actually attributable to the right properties and undertaking rate finding activities. But it seems that for 26-27, government have concluded that they no longer wish for authorities to take the risk of mandatory reliefs. They're not incentivising authorities with regard to reliefs anymore, as they're going to fund them via Section 31 grant, which is what they're describing as the move to the gross rate system. So if they're going to fund mandatory reliefs via Section 31 grant, they've top sliced an amount from the forecast funds available for business rates retention for 26-27 to cover that cost. So it doesn't mean additional resources for the sector, unfortunately. It's just moving it around, as it were. But we're guessing government will keep this under review, depending on how much mandatory cost reliefs are going to cost them going forwards. Thank you, Chris. So this taking away of risk around mandatory reliefs, funding them via Section 31 and operating on this gross rate system has meant they've managed to make other simplifications to the system and to the form as well. I've already mentioned this not having to split between the small and standard multipliers for each element of the form anymore. It's just the gross rates that have to be split between the 5 multipliers. It has already been mentioned that governments will be paying Section 31 grants to local authorities on 100% share. Now the billing authority will receive 100% of forecast Section 31 grant based on the NNDL 1, and it will be going directly into the collection fund. This will be necessary, and again, we suggested this approach might be useful to authorities. There'll be obviously a lot more Section 31 grants floating around now that mandatory reliefs as well as discretionary funded reliefs are going to be funded by Section 31. And obviously we've historically had the timing differences with Section 31 in terms of surpluses and deficits being obviously accounted for in the collection fund, subject to the statutory override. So those surpluses and deficits created by awarding additional reliefs. But the Section 31 grant obviously been accounted for on an accruals basis in the general fund in the year to which it relates. So obviously moving to this new system where more or less mandatory or discretionary funded reliefs in year will be compensated via Section 31 grant into the collection fund, that should take away that element of the surpluses and deficits, and it will also get rid of the timing difference in the Section 31 grant recognition. It obviously won't be happening in the general fund, it'll all be part of the collection fund. Next slide, please, Chris. So in terms of getting the Section 31 grants into the collection fund, there's going to have to be an update to the definition of non-domestic rating income in the regulations to allow that to go into there. And non-domestic rating income will just become a bigger number, of which authority will just take its usual proportionate share. So the Section 31 grants obviously going to be including amounts for the reliefs that are going to be funded, the mandatory and discretionary, although they're only funding the discretionary funded reliefs in designated areas. And obviously the Section 31 grants I've already mentioned for the supplement and discount approach for the RHL multipliers and the higher value multipliers. The good news is there's no Section 31 grants on top-ups and tariffs to have to deal with anymore. So that's another simplification. So Section 31 grants will be going into the collection fund. Based on the NNDR1 estimate, all of the Section 31 grant on account will initially be paid to the billing authority to take into the collection fund. and billing authorities will then distribute it back to central government and to preceptors as part of the normal proportionate shares of non-domestic rating income. Obviously, just being aware of cash flow risks potentially for the billing authority. Underestimating your reliefs on your NNDR1 will mean the government obviously holds on to that Section 31 grant until such time as we get to the settlement of the NNDR3 reconciliation amounts. Obviously, if you are estimating more reliefs on your Section 30, your NNDR1, you'll get more of that Section 31 grant up front until such times as the reconciliation may or may not need to take it off you when we get to the NNDR3 stage. Thank you, Chris. So the only true discretionary reliefs are not going to be funded on Section 31 grant are those all top-ups to the things like charity, non-profit, casks. Those will not be funded by Section 31 grants, so will be a risk or reward to the collection fund, so they could result in a surplus or deficit depending on what you forecast on NNDR1 compared to what you outturn at on NNDR3. Thank you, Chris. And obviously, lastly, just a reminder about budgeting based on the NNDR1. Obviously, Section 31 grants are now going into the collection fund, so we don't expect the amounts that are shown as Section 31 grant on Part 1C of the form for information. We don't expect to see any Section 31 grant appearing in your general fund budget. You need to be concentrating on Part 1B of the form in terms of the amounts taken into your budget. They are the cash flow amounts. And not forgetting, obviously, good old Part 4 of the NNDR1 farm, the prior year surplus or deficit, still needs to be included in the budget. Whatever comes through from Part 4, your share of will be taken into your budget for 26, 27. And again, you can use our Module 2 of the collection fund to help support with that. Thank you, Chris. Just moving on to the reset then and how that is impacting on the form. Obviously, back in 13-14, every authority was given two baselines. The business rates baseline, what government thought you could bring in business rates, the baseline funding level, what it thought you needed in funding from business rates, which they are resetting under the system as obviously reality has diverged from these over time. Each authority has been set a new business rates baseline of what the government expects its income to be for 26-27, of which your top-up or tariff is then adjusted to bring that back to what your new baseline funding level is under the fair funding allocations. So have they calculated business rates baseline? Well, there was a calculator published along with the settlement, although we did know the key elements that were going to go into that from the policy statement. So obviously the new business rates baseline is going to have to reflect all the changes to the system around reval, the gross rate system. It's not reflecting the new multipliers because they will obviously be adjusted in or out via Section 31 grant. So they're using the RV from the 26 list, which will be updated to the final list with an adjustment to top up or tariff to bring you in line with that final position. We've got bad debt provisions set at 0.6% of gross rates payable. Appeals provision, we've already mentioned 3.75% and from the OBR report. Deductions for renewables and designated areas based on an NNDR3 24-25 at the minute, but will be updated, and the usual deduction for cost of collection. Thank you, Chris. There is a nice picture in the settlement publication to help us get our heads around that as well, if you like that picture better than the word explanation, as it were. Baseline funding level is obviously being calculated in aggregate with a deduction for those mandatory reliefs that I was talking about being funded and apportioned using the new formula approaches. Thank you, Chris. Again, obviously, we've got some incentives built into the system in terms of the rates retention system. Government has obviously made some judgments around incentivising authorities. Appeals in there at 3.75% means that authorities which obviously experience appeals of more than 3.75% will lose out. Those experiencing less than the average 3.75% will win, which was obviously as the system was set up before. Bad debt provision is now brought within this scope as well, with there at 0.6% of gross rates payable. So similar to for appeals, authorities writing off more than 0.6% will lose, and those writing off less will obviously win from the system. So this approach to bad debt provision obviously has some important implications. Given that there's no adjustment for historic performance, everybody's been held to the same standard on that. So it's sort of questioning whether that is fair or not, or does it avoid rewarding historic failure? No adjustments for reliefs, which encourages authorities to obviously award more relief. There's no requirement to minimise relief if you're getting Section 31 grant in that as well. The more relief that can be awarded, obviously it reduces the amount that you need to collect and less challenging in terms of achieving it. And no adjustment for the new multipliers. Obviously you are encouraged therefore to apply the RHL multipliers. Again, the more that can be awarded, the less you need to collect and therefore less challenging the collection target. Thank you, Chris. Wouldn't be NNDR 1 if we didn't mention good old appeals in terms of the views that you need to take about the amounts you're going to include in the NNDR 1 form for provisions. Obviously, the need for consistency of the year end and the surplus or deficit that you're estimating for 25-26. So on the NNDR 1 part 4, obviously we need to be making judgments around the 17 and 23 lists. So what is going to be charged against those provisions, do you think, at year end, and how are you going to adjust them up or down? 17 provision perhaps just about finished maybe in your area. 23, how many people are going to perhaps throw the hat in the ring in the next few weeks in terms of getting in a potential check challenge before the year end? And then obviously on part 3, that only reflects the new 26 list. How much do you need to set aside for 26, 27? That will obviously impact on the non-domestic rating income for 26, 27 and how much you are taking into your budget therefore for that. Thank you, Chris. Obviously, the $1 million question is how do we calculate the amounts to go into the provisions? Different approaches, different things to consider. Obviously, the CLG allowance. We've had different allowances for the different lists, 17, 23, the new 3.75 for the 26 list. Obviously, your local information as well around what's happened locally. Have you got any particularly large sites that could cause you a bigger risk in terms of losses? Benchmarking against other authorities, which obviously we include in our Module 3 support to authorities. So when you provide us with your NNDR 1 draft, we'll compare that as to where that puts you against your nearest neighbours, your regional area, against the country as a whole. Obviously, you may use rating advisors like Analyse Local, taking their figures either entirely or adjusting them locally. And obviously thinking about calculating on a small standard multiplier, excluding or including transition, depending on how you look at that. And obviously for 26, excluding the impact of the RHL and higher value multipliers, given they will be Section 31 adjusted back if any appeals are settled and bills change. Thank you, Chris. So lastly, to finish off my section, safety net and levy have not gone away. They are still there as part of the system, but they have changed or are going to change in terms of the way that they work. We know that funding can't drop below a certain level using safety net, and levy, which is obviously there designed to fund the safety net and sort of limits the gains to a certain extent that authorities make. Levy and safety net is a transaction between the authority and the government and is again accounted for on an accruals basis, so can lead to timing differences given it needs to be accrued for in the year that it relates to. Adrian did mention the levy and safety net account with the government, the ring-fenced account, that they must account for those amounts in. The Secretary of State makes the decision about whether to allocate any extra funds in the account back to government. In the draft settlement, there was no announcement made about an amount, but there could be an announcement at the final settlement. We don't know yet. Could be that because of the 100% safety net that I'm going to mention in 2 seconds, they decide to hold back more of that levy account within central government to cover that, or it could be that they decide they've got enough and they'll get enough from the new levy system to cover it, and there may well be a distribution, but that distribution is normally accounted for in the year in which it's announced. So any announcement in the 26-27 final settlement we would expect to be accounted for in 25-26. Next slide please, Chris. So safety net, as I mentioned, we know we're getting 100% safety net guarantee for 26-27, but that is going to be scaled back to our usual proportions. By the time we get back to 28-29, we'll be back to 92.5% safety net funding there, which is what the charts show us in terms of the risk obviously being passed back to government of that element that won't be funded by safety net as we get towards 28-29. We are expecting safety net on account to be paid based on NNDR1 positions, not levy payments on account, so similar to previously. Next slide, please, Chris. Just being aware, a heads up for anybody who's planning on budgeting for safety net, if your NNDR1 shows that you may be due some safety net on account and you decide to budget for that, all well and good, but just be aware that it may throw up a timing difference if it then comes to light by we get to NNDR3 that your position has improved. Because if you are not needing safety net by we get to NNDR3, you will obviously need to pay back any safety net on account and it won't be featuring in your outturn position. Hopefully, because you have improved your position, you will be getting a surplus and that surplus will be coming through in future years, but you won't be having the safety net to account for in 26-27. It'll be just coming through as budget potentially in 27-28 or 28-29. So just a note of caution that if you are budgeting for safety net and you don't end up in safety net, there will be an impact on your 26-27 outturn. Next slide, please, Chris. Levy-wise, levy is changing. Obviously, we've always had the capped at 50% levy only applying to tariff authorities. From 26-27, we're moving to the marginal levy rate approach. So the calculation is going to be akin as to calculating, for example, an income tax calculation. So it's banded depending on the amount of growth that you actually make and the amount of levy that you then pay on those elements. So it's going to mean that pooling is very different going forwards. It'll be about matching high and low growth authorities rather than top up and tariff positions. Tariff authorities, therefore, are going to have a higher incentive to grow and will receive a disproportionately high level of growth in their funding from rates retention, whereas all top-up authorities are now brought into scope of having to pay a levy. Top-up authorities always had their levy rate set at 0 previously. Now anybody with any growth is going to be subject to a levy. So top-up authorities are going to have to grow even more significantly to see any increase in their funding. And then just lastly from me on that, in terms of what the next steps are, please. Sorry, yes, Chris, thank you. So hopefully, as of today is the 16th of January. Like I say, hopefully yesterday you made your council tax declaration. You've now got 7 working days to notify that to your preceptors. Obviously in the next 2 weeks, 31st of January coming along, the NNDR1 submission. Mentioned module 3 meetings, please get yours in the diary if you haven't already. Module 2, if you're using it to forecast that of our tools, then please obviously send that through, we can check it. February we're going to be doing some preparation for close down webinars, planned for the 3rd, date for the diary. More close down preparation obviously in March around getting the module 1 accounting models ready and issued pre-NNDR3, and then obviously close down comes along once again in April. And then we hope to see you once we're back out on the road, once we're let out again, once we get past year end, we'll be at the IRRV conference, CFN conference, etc. So thank you very much. Obviously I'll be around for questions at the end, and thank you for doing the slides, Chris.
Yes, thanks very much, Caroline and Chris. A very helpful presentation, and obviously thanks for all the work you're doing to support authorities preparing their NNDR1, because it's potentially the most challenging NNDR1 and wider process since rates retention was introduced in 13-14. So obviously there's a lot of issues for authorities to think about as a result of that. Probably one final thing I'll say is obviously authorities should have now calculated their council tax surplus as of yesterday, so there's no need to wait 7 working days, because unlike when the regulations were written in 1992, we have emails now, so there's no need to wait until Monday week, even though that's technically the deadline. But I just add that as a precept. Probably not many of us on the line, but I thought I'd raise that point anyway. So we're now about 3 or 4 minutes earlier than ahead of schedule. So obviously, I'm happy to take a couple of quick questions before 11 before we go off on a break. So see, I think Philip, you put a question in the chat about do we have any details of the deadline for 2023 list check challenge appeals. I think, as far as I'm aware, it's presumably going to follow a similar process to the closure of the 2017 lists, but I don't know if there's any revenues colleagues that want to sort of follow up on that in terms of the timescales. And I think Joanne, in is the 3.75% for appeals and bad debts. I think that's, as far as I'm aware, a provision over the period of the 3 years, but obviously there could be an annual impact. So again, there's probably sort of a couple of questions that we can pick up as part of the wider Q&A a bit later on. So I think on that point, unless there's any other questions, we'll have a short 5-minute break and then catch up again about 11:15. So I'll give you sort of 7 or 8 minutes to have a think about things, and obviously then we'll come back for Mark's presentation after that. So see you in about 7 or 8 minutes time. Welcome back, everybody. So it's now 11:15, so we'll now commence with the next presentation, which is Mark Catlow from LGF Technical, who's going to look at some of the other aspects of business rates retention changes, including the impact of the reset, the new baselines, and also some wider issues like designated areas and renewables as well. So I'll hand over to Mark for his presentation.
Thanks, thank you all. So a few of the sessions I'm going to cover are, is everyone okay? Just a few of the sessions I'm going to cover, topics I'm going to cover, kind of build on what Caroline has covered. So I won't kind of drag over those too much again. So I might run slightly ahead of time. We'll see how we go. The session today really is about trying to be as practical as possible. And it's built on my experience of being a kind of practitioner and having that kind of discussion about this time of year when you get the finance settlement and the director of finance walks in the room and goes, so what we're going to put in then? And you haven't got your NNDR1. And so you kind of, all you've got is your baseline funding level. And then the director, you tentatively agree that you're going to budget at baseline. And then the answer is, but what exactly does it mean? How does it fit through to my budget lines? And how actually, if I put this big kind of lump of baseline funding in, how am I going to split it out in my budget and actually try and monitor it going forward? So I'm going to try and walk through that process over the next 20 minutes or so and give some practical tips. The first slide really is one that Caroline has covered in our last session, so I won't go too much about it again. I will say Caroline did mention a baseline calculator, and that is the link on there. So if you want to have a look at it, you Google it. Google brings it up as well, but there's the link to the baseline calculator. And I think for me, following on from what Caroline said about the kind of design of the new system, I think for me, the fundamental thing to grasp is what the government have done is they've separated funding from billing within the new system, so that it doesn't really matter too much what businesses are billed now. The local authorities' funding and income reverts to being based on all at small or standard multiplier. Okay, and Caroline covered that in her presentation, so I won't go too much into this. What I will do though is go on to kind of the practical implication of what you're all facing at the moment. And so it's kind of where I started, which is, okay, then, well, should we budget for baseline funding or not? And the questions such as, well, how granular does a budget need to be? And can we get a granular budget at this stage to be able to produce something that we can monitor against and we can identify what's moving, what's going to be a real variance and what's going to reverse out? Okay, so the unwilling victim in this event or this presentation is Leicester. For no reason, it was just the first one that I came up against. And we're going to walk through Leicester as an example. Okay, so you'll see on the slide there the baseline funding calculations. That's the key information. You've got for Leicester, they've got a baseline funding level of 145 million, and they're paying they get a top up of 69.1. Okay, so that's kind of the information you've got at the moment. But just putting 145.1 million in as a composite of those two figures into your budget is not going to allow you to monitor things going forwards. Because what you need to be able to do, you need to be able to, somewhere in your budget working papers, be able to reconcile these figures back to changes in your NNDR1 and to track what's called technical adjustments as we move through until the 1st of April. Okay, so how do we start doing that? Well, let's start with the baseline funding level. And again, Caroline kind of produced this diagram, but this kind of, you know, it's got different colours on, I suppose, but it's the same process. Nationally, how has the government produced baseline fundings? Well, they started off by looking at the gross rates payable, which is on the left. They rebased that all and they valued that at all at small and standard multiplier, and they came up at just over 19 billion or something like that. Then they took off allowances, losses, and Caroline mentioned 3.75% of gross rates payable for appeals, 0.6% for bad debt. Then they took off disregards, and that's where you get to your business rates baseline. The slides are not moving on. Oh, right, okay. That is a problem because they are moving on my screen. Are the slides not moving on everyone's screen? Move now. So there's a bit of a lag, is there? Right, okay. We are where we are with technology, I suppose, aren't we? So once they've taken off disregards, you get to the first blue line, which is the business rates baseline. And then, as Caroline said, what they did, they took off an allowance for the cost of reliefs. And that effectively is creating cash within the system to allow them to fund the expanded reliefs. Okay, and then you get to the second blue line, which is the business rates baseline, the baseline funding level. They have an element of direct funding distributed to the combined authorities and the GLA, and you end up with the fair funding BFL of just over 15 billion, which is distributed in accordance with fair funding shares. Okay, now that's at a national level. When you start to unpack that at an individual local authority level, what you get is this sort of thing. You get a change year on year between your baseline funding levels from 25-26 to 26-27 that's driven by two things if you're a 50% business rates retention authority, and three if you're an enhanced. But Leicester, our guinea pig here, are 50% retention, and I'm choosing those because it's easier than dealing with enhanced retention for this purposes. And as you can see, there's two elements that really drive the change in your individual baseline funding. One is the kind of change in quantum. So it's building in prior growth into the system, and it's the changes in national assumptions around losses and the cost of reliefs into the system. So there's an element of change in quantum, then there's an element in fair funding change between the amounts you're due in 25-26 and the updated fair funding shares in 26-27. And as you can see, Leicester, they've gained slightly through fair funding of 13.7 million. Some authorities, if you look at Woking and various other places, they lose significantly through fair funding. But the change year on year is mainly because of both a change in quantum nationally and then a change in the allocation mechanism under fair funding. And that will leave you with your new baseline funding level. For 100% retention, you've got another thing in there, which is RSG being rolled into baseline funding under the scheme. So, okay, so we've now got to the point where we're beginning to understand what's driving the changes in baseline funding. Okay, but it still doesn't help us with budgets. But we've got a trick up our sleeve with that. Okay, it's not a perfect trick and it won't solve all your problems, but it helps. So we've got our standard equation here. Business rates baseline less tariff plus top up equals your baseline funding level. Well, let's reverse that. Start off with your baseline funding level, 145.1. Adjust for your tariff or top up, 69.7. You get your business rates baseline for Leicester of 75.3. Okay, is everyone okay with that? Yeah. All right. To catch up with slides. Let me know when the slides load. We're having problems because I think Caroline was struggling with this as well. So. Are the slides updated yet at all?
Yeah, currently looking at baseline funding levels, like the
right.
main one, the previous slide, sorry.
Right, okay, so yeah, I'll scroll it. It is actually, it's just there's a lag apparently in the system, which is not updating the slides. So I'm struggling with the same thing. I think we're struggling with the same thing Caroline faced here. So is it, let me know when the slide, we're on, should
They've
be on the
moved
slide.
now.
Budget,
It's now
right,
budget
okay.
for BFL.
Okay, fine. So I will go back. So from that baseline funding, that national allocation of baseline funding, what you can then do, you can use the business rates baseline calculator to help you start to disaggregate your baseline funding level, the components of your baseline funding level. And how do you do that? Well, as the slide says, what you do is you start off, you can work backwards from your baseline funding level. You can then adjust for your tariff or top up to leave you with your business rates baseline. Now, your business rates baseline is explained in the business rates baseline calculator, okay, which is on screen. That's Leicester's on screen. Now, it's not a perfect mirror for your budget, as the blue box says. You know, this is your business rates baseline. This is not your NDR income for the year, because there will be some things in the blue box that you'll need to adjust for, okay? But what this does, this unpacks your business rates baseline and begins to allow you to see the components to allow you to monitor them and assess what's moving as you go through your budget, your NNDR1, and to the 1st of April. Okay. Now, let's think about what might change. Hopefully, the slide it might not take so long to update the slide this time. Let me know when the slide changes. No.
Still waiting.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on to a couple of slides, and because otherwise this is going to take too long. So, but I'll make certain we get the key points. There seems to be some kind of massive lag in the system.
Try turning off your camera. It's lagging as well.
There you go. So you should get a slide that says updating the business rates baseline calculation.
Not yet, sorry.
Not yet. Crikey.
Has anybody else got the slides? Because Chrissy's was a lot quicker at updating.
Yeah, I don't think anyone else has the slides, I'm afraid. This is just...
Yeah, it's updated now.
Right, okay. So
might be updated, yeah. Lots of things, but maybe not the slides very quickly, but that's appeared now.
So what we've got in your business rates baseline, you've got two things, okay? What someone's sent them to. I'm just going to go through it, Chris, if that's okay. I'll get to the key points and then I'll stop. So once you've got your business rates baseline calculation, okay, there's a number of changes that will occur from the figures in your business rates baseline. Now, some of those changes will reverse out during 26-27 via a technical adjustment. And that's because part of the data in your business rates baseline is based on draft rates list as in September, so whenever, you know, and the actual business rates baseline will be based on the actual rates list on the 1st of April. Okay, so anything to do with a figure in your baseline that relates to a rateable value, if it changes between the finance settlement figure, the NNDR1 figure, and the 1st of April, it will reverse out via a technical adjustment to your top up or tariff at the end of 26-27. Okay, and those are the figures in green on your slide. Okay, But there are things that you need to be aware of as part of budgeting and your NNDR1. And those are the things in red. Those are the things that if you decide, quite rightly, if you make a professional estimate to move away from 3.75% of your gross rates payable for your appeals provision in your NNDR1 and in your budget, that is a local choice for you, and it will have a bottom line impact that won't reverse. Okay, so you've got appeals provisions, bad debt, unlikely for cost collection, and City of London. Okay, it's really appeals and bad debt that you need to keep an eye on. And what you're doing here, once you've got your figures that's in your business rates baseline for Leicester, appeals is 6.1, you're monitoring it as you produce your NNDR form. And if, say, Leicester produced an appeals allowance in their NNDR1 of 12 million, what effectively they're doing is they're budgeting, or they're planning to be funded below your baseline funding at that point, because your NNDR1 income is less than the government has allowed for in the business rates baseline. Okay, so it's something you need to monitor as you go through. Now, those are the red lines. Now, cross your fingers. Let's hopefully this will be quicker. Let me know when this changes. If it doesn't, I can kind of go to the key slides here. So technical adjustments to baselines, which you should show. No.
Still not.
I'm going to, because of the timing of this, I'm going to go to the key things about it. Okay.
Oh, this is now up.
Right. So does it show, let's step this through, starting position? Right. Okay. Have we got a slide that says, let's step this through, starting position, and NDR1 equals BRB?
It's got technical adjustments to baselines.
Right, okay.
Although, it's just moved on. So
right, it's updated now. So this is a practical example. I'm kind of defeated by, we've all been defeated by technology, but let's get to the practical example here, which is the important one. So this really is Leicester, okay? And what you've got on the screen is in the white column, you've got your business rates baseline figures. And in your NNDR1 column, I've just replicated that. Yeah, so everything that you put in your NNDR1 replicates your business rates baseline figures. Your rateable value, your appeals assessments, your bad debt provision. And in that case, there is no change to your top upward tariff because of the technical adjustment, because you're not including any changes in rateable value in your NNDR1. Okay, and equally on the other side of the equation, for changes in bad debts and appeals, there's no change in your bottom line either, because you're using consistent assumptions in your NNDR1 for the cost of appeals and allowances, okay, against the business rates baseline. So again, there's no change. Yeah. But let's introduce some change. Okay. Let me know when that updates. You should see some different arrows appear on your screen.
Just red boxes so far.
Okay. I did a presentation yesterday and there was no problem, so I have no idea what the issue was. It's clearly, has it updated?
It may be if you go forward 2 slides and back 1, it might actually work.
Let's go. There you go.
Grey arrows have appeared.
Yes, fantastic. Right, so I've introduced some change now. Okay. Jez, sorry about this. We're just going to have to, you know, it will appear. So what's happened now? You'll see what I've done is from the NNDR1 to the 1st of April, your rateable value in the top red box has changed. Okay. Now, a change in rateable value is going to drive a technical adjustment to neutralize that change as long as the rateable value changes before the 1st of April. And you can see going down to the second red box, that increase in rateable value from what net rates payable, gross rates payable from 163 million to 180 million has changed, it's reduced the top up payable because it now reflects the fact that gross rates payable has increased, therefore you need a lower top up. Okay, and so you'll see in the bottom box, changes in rateable value can create technical adjustments, and in our case, it's a technical adjustment of £8 million. Now, it's important to understand this mechanic. I was dealing with a council yesterday that had a BRB gross rateable value of 62 million. In the January list they were using for their NNDR1, that's a drop to 59 million, 3 million drop. And at some point, you know, you had to explain that that is going to get offset. That is not going to be a real change in bottom line funding because it's a change in rateable value before the 1st of April. It's going to be offset by a change in their top up to neutralize the changes in RV. Okay, that's a real example from yesterday. So you need to be aware of this mechanism. Now, the final slide. Keep all our fingers crossed that this updates us. I'm going to introduce one final change. Okay. Let me know when the slide updates, if that's okay.
Dated.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So there's another sort of change you need to be aware of. It's the one that was in the red box on that analysis. Okay, it's where you depart from the calculation in your business rates baseline for appeals and bad debts, because changes they could be quite justified professionally. You know, a national allocation of 3.75% of your GRP, it might be right nationally, but by definition, it's going to be wrong individually because it's an average. Okay, so you're likely to have changes or departures from that 3.75% appeals provision and the 0.6% bad debt provision allowance. And in our case, Leicester has increased it from 6 million to 9 million, the appeals provision. It's gone up by 50%. So. And the bad debt deduction has gone up from 983,000 to 1.5 million. Now, what's happening there is if you scroll down to the bottom box, that's a real impact on funding. That's £2 million. Okay, because it's not reversed by the technical adjustment. You've still got the technical adjustment in there of £8 million to your top up or tariff, but that only relates to changes in rateable value before the 1st of April. Yeah, so you can see what you need to do is it's not sufficient. If I go to my last slide, and I'm not going to kind of go any further. Well, actually, I will do one final slide if I can. No, I'll do this on my last slide because I don't want to put everyone up. Then let me know when the slide updates.
This is now on granular BFL budget.
That's perfect, right? Yeah. So the key thing, big picture stuff, is when you get asked, should you budget for baseline funding? Well, really, you should be budgeting for the NNDR1. Okay, but if you budget for baseline funding, what you've got to do is start to unpack that kind of lump of baseline funding into lines that you can monitor against, because things will change. Things will change between the draft, the count figures in the baseline funding and the business rates baseline, between the figures in your NNDR1, which you will get at the end of the year in the general fund, and on the 1st of April, where you calculate your final changes to do with rateable value. Unless you're tracking those, what you're getting is you're getting hallucinations in your budget monitoring position. I go back to the council I discussed this with yesterday, when they thought they'd got a £3 million reduction in their business rates income because their gross rates payable had dropped from 62 million to 59. It's not. It's going to be reversed out by a technical adjustment because it relates to changes in rateable value before the 1st of April. Okay, so you've got to distinguish between real changes and changes that are reversed. Okay, one final slide. I apologize. This is important, and I'm make no bones about making everyone wait for this to load. So if you let me know, you should have a slide that says mapping your NNDR1 to the budget. Yeah. Okay. So it's hopefully the slide is updated now. Okay. Has it?
No.
No. I don't think I've ever had this as bad in any presentation I've ever done. So.
Well, it will be uploaded to YouTube, so it'll be possible to fast forward
well,
through the gaps anyway. So apologies for that. Yeah, it's updated now, mapping NNDR1 to the budget.
What I will do is I'll send through a PDF of the slides, and you can send the slides out to everyone. Okay. This really is absolutely critical. Once you have your budget and your NNDR1, you need to reconcile them. Okay. And your budget, NNDR1 and the budget, the thing in the lines in the grey box will form your, your elements in your budget from your NNDR1. Okay. It won't be the same as your business rates baseline, because as the slapped box in the top right hand corner says, your actual NNDR1 might include growth. It will include Section 31 grant funding, various other things. Don't forget to remove the stuff that's been rolled into RSG. Okay, if you've still got lines in your budget for under indexation and under indexation top up, adjustments for under indexation of your top up or tariff, take those out, because all the under indexation funding is now in RSG. Same with green plant and machinery, same with the supplementary loss yield compensation. Okay, so don't have a look, don't automatically roll forward the same budget lines year on year. And then on the left, which I won't go through, is the other stuff that you might need to think about when you're preparing your budget. And I'm going to stop there to save the pain.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, for that helpful presentation. Apologies for the technology issues, but hopefully I think everyone found it very useful, because it just helped to sort of put the challenges that authorities are going to be facing in terms of the budgeting, and obviously the fact that we're departing from one system to while it is still business rates retention, very significant changes that will impact on budgeting and accounting arrangements as well. So I think that's been very helpful, and obviously for authorities, for example, they've got designated
And
areas.
I
There can be
apologise.
specific
Yeah,
challenges.
I'm really sorry to everybody. But I don't know what was causing that. It's first time it's happened, so I apologise to everyone.
Oh, that's fine. Well, it's not your
Hopefully,
fault.
everyone got some of the messages.
We can blame Microsoft. So I hope they'll be paying lots of business rates anyway to help pay for us the next 12 months anyway from the UK offices. So that's obviously been a very helpful update, and I think it helps to put some of the issues in context. And obviously what we may be hoping to do a bit later in the year is to have another session that we're looking at some of the accounting issues, and obviously perhaps initially on 25, 26, and then more generally in terms of the challenges for 26, 27, because certainly, there's going to be a lot of issues around analytical reviews for auditors in terms of comparing 25, 26, 26, 27. So that's going to be a very important piece of work that we'll all need to consider over the next 12 months or so. So we'll now move on to our final presentation from John Ballantyne, who's now taken over in sort of Mike Heiser's former role at the LGA. So obviously Mike would have come along and presented at previous Collection Fund Network. So I'll now hand over to John to give us an update on the things local government finance and funding related and sort of business rates retention related from the LGA's perspective.
Hello, everyone. Yes, as Martin kindly said, I've taken over from Martin Mitchell. You might also notice that Martin Mitchell probably had more local government finance experience than I have years on this earth, so forgive me for that lack. But yeah, I thought I'd take you through what the LGA has been up to, is going to be up to going forwards, mostly with the aim to see, well, if any of you can help us with things, if you have any more questions, like show you what we're up to so that you can get involved and we can help each other out, as is our role. So you'll be happy to know I don't have any slides. So starting off, last week the LGA had its finance conference. We had some ministers in, we had director of MHCLG in, and various different speakers, which was a really good event. Slightly ruined by the storm that caused some of our delegates to come back to leave early, but it was really good, and there will be another one next year. So I encourage you to think ahead that far and look out for that when we start advertising it next October. It's a really good event, really good to get people in for that. Moving on a bit into the new year, we've just submitted our response to the Provisional Local Government Finance Settlement. The themes on that we were really hammering were, pardon me, really hammering is, so our main points from that, in addition to answering the questions, you'll be able to read this on the, you'll be able to read this when we publish it, which should be later today, and I'll hopefully send that to you along with the slides from everybody else's presentations today. Moving on by 2 whole days, we have put out a CFO survey. The deadline for that is today. So if you haven't submitted that from your councils, could you please double check on that and get that in to us by the end of the day? It's really going to inform our spring statement, our submission to the spring statement, should I say, that will be on the 3rd of March. Moving on to audit, we are on the MHCLG's transition board, which is overseeing the audit reform. Their next meeting is on the 20th of January that we will be going to. So if you have anything if you want to know anything about that, or if you want to have anything raised at that, please get in touch with us. Yes, so that will be on audit. On additional consultations, we've had a meeting this week with CIPFA, looking at the Prudential Code and Treasury Management Code. There will be new codes and new guidance, particularly around mandating the liability benchmark. The formal consultation is not expected until well into March now. And we're also expecting a consultation from MHCLG on statutory investment guidance, but not until not until the CIPFA one is done. So that will be later on in the year. On devolution, the Laws Committee is coming up for the devolution bill. So the Laws Committee stage, and the deadline for the Lords amendments is the 16th of January, so also today. So we will be issuing a briefing to parliamentarians next week on that to see how that goes. On business rates, there is a consultation out following the Transforming Business Rates interim report. So that's the business rates and investment call for evidence. We have created a draft. If you are interested in that, you'll notice that it's majoritarily aimed at businesses themselves. So the LGA has not had opinions on most of the questions there, but we have got a response in draft form. And if you are creating any responses yourselves, if you could send those to us, that would be very useful. And if you're interested in ours, please get in contact with me and I'll be able to share with you our answers. Or at least our thoughts. I will admit they are not, as I said, it's mostly aimed at businesses, so our responses are limited at the moment. On council tax, the MHCLG is working on its response to the modernising and improving administration of council tax, which should come out in January, February. So we're looking forward to seeing that. Apparently, there's a large number of responses to factor in. And we are also involved in the high value council tax surcharge investigation. That is, well, we met with them earlier this week on that. They're very early in their planning stages for that, and it looks like it's not going to, nothing significant is going to come out of that for a while yet. And finally, the department, so MHCG, is interested in whether the current levers to councils on empty homes, including council tax premium and fines for providing false information, is sufficient. So if you have any views on that, could you contact Luke Masters, so my alternative also at the LGA. That would be very kind and useful for us. And finally, last but not least, on the visitor levy, we're currently working with LGA members to produce a cross-party response to the consultation, which closes on the 18th of February. We're very keen to hear views from councils on these issues and on the consultation more broadly. So again, if you have any thoughts on the visitor levy, the LGA is very interested to hear from you. And that's everything work-wise that the LGA is currently, work-wise that the LGA finance grouping is working on at the moment. Obviously, it's a very busy time. And in addition to this, you might have heard rumours that the LGA is currently running a consultation on their operating model. We're currently in a 45-day period of consultation with Workforce on how the LGA operates. They've produced, management have produced a new operating model. So the way in which the LGA engages with external people and who you might already engage with the LGA may be subject to change in the coming year. Obviously, this is all new to us at the moment, so please wait out for more information on that. And yeah, that is a very, very fast rundown of everything that we're up to at the LGA. And yeah, thank you very much. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks very much, John, for that update. So, see, clearly we're focusing on some of these immediate reforms that are happening, but there's lots of other things happening in the world of local government funding and finance. Obviously, you've highlighted the visitor levy, the managing tax or high value council tax surcharge, which we're coming in 2028. Obviously, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And clearly, given the issues and challenges that, the government's had over business rates in the last couple of weeks, obviously there's consultation or the invitation to comment on business rates, further changes potentially, including looking at avoidance, etc. That also closes, I think, the same date as the visitor levy in mid-February, which is an ideal time from the perspective of local authority budgeting, but such is the nature of things. Obviously, the government is keen to move ahead and, undertake further reforms to the system. So we'll have to wait and see how those impact on what we've been discussing over the last couple of hours. So obviously, I appreciate. See, we started at 10 o'clock, so obviously feel free now to leave if you've sort of got what you need to have the presentation, have to go to another meeting, and we will circulate the presentations and relevant contact details if you don't have them for all the speakers. So very much thank you to them for joining today and doing their presentations, and obviously conscious they've all been very critical in terms of aiding local authorities in terms of understanding the fair funding reforms and the NNDL1 changes. And obviously, you know, without them, we wouldn't have had much idea for the last 12 months beyond very technical government documents about what was actually happening within the system. So it's obviously been very helpful. So now, opportunity for the last 20 minutes or so, if people have got any questions, either they can put them in the chat or feel free to sort of go on camera as well if you would prefer to ask the question, and we'll do our best to answer them. So I think we'll start with the questions in the chat, and then we'll pick up sort of any face-to-face questions that people want to raise. So I think we've already covered the issues around the closure of the 2023 rating list. Obviously, in terms of check challenge appeals, people have until the 31st of March this year to submit those appeals, and then the VI obviously have further sort of 12 months in terms of making amendments to the lists, and I don't think we're expecting those deadlines to change, but I think, as you would appreciate, we might well expect an awful lot of ratepayers, particularly some of the larger ratepayers who haven't made any check challenge appeals yet, to do that over the next few weeks, given the closure of the list, because obviously there's an incentive potentially from technical rating agents to you know, in terms of timing and obviously the benefits of any refunds, to sort of submit those late, and given the nature of the situation, you're going to submit those once. So that is where we sit in terms of the closure of the 2023 list. I think the point's also been picked up around the appeals and bad debt provision. That's an annual provision, which obviously is assumed to be effectively a fixed percentage by central government over the life of the list, but clearly authorities will have to make their own judgments. And, you know, as we've seen with this rating list, there are some hereditaments, quite large hereditaments in some cases, that have seen very exceptional increases in rateable values. I mean, airports and major arenas and stadiums, you know, hotels, which obviously have seen rateable value increases way in excess of, you know, the average increases for pubs, for example. I mean, I think hotels in central London, rateable value increases more than 4 times the average for pubs, but there's been relatively little coverage of those sectors by comparison. So obviously we'll have to wait and see what further announcements the government make around pubs and potentially hospitality relief or changes to multipliers over the next few weeks. And obviously that does throw up additional challenges to local authorities in terms of billing and NNDL1 preparation, because potentially, you know, some of the numbers and metrics may change imminently. So see, there's a question for Mark from Lindsay Parkinson. Refer to the local authorities gross rates for the NNDL1 less than the in the BRB calculation. How is the local authority dealing with it in their budget? Are they budgeting for a tariff adjustment? Because obviously there's been changes, well, the new draft list issued, and obviously there'll be a final list at the end of March, which will also be after budgets are set. So whether, Mark, you want to, I think you've picked that up anyway, but whether you want to sort of cover it in the wider chat.
I feel a bit, I feel a bit kind of tentative about it, because it's, and you know, I'm certain Caroline will be able to help out with this. I mean, I do feel it's the example I was discussing with the authorities. What I would do is, if I knew my GRV had changed significantly, and most technical adjustments are not big, there's you know, a few thousand quid, but if you've got a big technical adjustment that you know is going to get, is because of changing RV before the 1st of April, unless you calculate that technical adjustment and show it almost as a separate line, adjusting line in your budget, to say, you know, don't you know, show it separately to your actual LGF, you know, top up or tariff. But otherwise, what you're doing there is you're kind of including in your budget a deficit that you know is not real. So it's difficult, but I would be tempted to try and calculate these technical adjustments if material. If it's a few tens of thousands of quid, who cares, you know? But if it's going to move you from a tariff to a top up, this technical adjustment, you know, it's worth at least considering, you know, reporting it and bearing it in mind during in-year monitoring. Otherwise, the members are just going to get very, very, very confused when you try and explain it to them. you know, we've got a surplus, but it's not really a surplus because we've got a tariff adjustment coming along and it's going to wipe out that surplus. Members are just going to get very, very confused with that, aren't they?
Well, I think it's probably challenging enough to explain all this to Section 151s and deputies, given the complexity of it. So I know a very leading revenues expert was sort of trying to read the regulations for the Support and Small Business Relief Scheme, and he said it's probably the most complicated relief scheme he's seen, and he's been doing this for 30 odd years.
There's a quote, isn't there? There's a quote I always use about there's if you're involved with local government finance, you're either dead, mad, or something else. And it was Rishi Sunak when he wasn't even the Treasury and the Chancellor was just a Treasury Minister. I'll see if I can dig it out and send it through, but it just illustrates how crazily strange, you know, this finance system is.
Well, such the nature of thing. We're working on property values from 30 odd years ago and still using regulations from, you know, 30 odd years ago. So it's absolutely crazy that lots of these things have just not got updated because there's been no sort of drive to do so. But it's the system we're in, so I suppose we have to make it work as far as possible.
Martin, I've got a few queries through about how the calculations work. If I put my email address in the slide, I'm happy for people to just email me rather than do that. Is that okay?
Because I think that's very helpful, because obviously appreciate there's some of these very complex technical things that are very difficult to sort of cover in a session like this. So obviously if they're very general answers, we can share them with the wider group as well. So that might be the easiest way to deal with some more complicated ones. Obviously I recognise Sarah Bryan's point around the challenges for preceptors, because clearly, you know, will you get your NNDL ones on time, and, you know, how accurate will they be? Inevitably billing authorities are making very creative estimates, and there's obviously, given the impact of the 100% safety net protection, is there sort of potential incentive for billing authorities to be cautious, or perhaps, I'm not saying understate income, obviously given the cash flow challenges, given they're obviously going to have to commit to pay a large portion of that money over to central government and their preceptors in central share and whatever the major preceptor share is. So that's obviously a challenge as well for preceptors in terms of the timings with all of this, but it's just the nature of, I think, where we sort of sit in the system. I think obviously there's various questions that for Mark have been covered, so I think he's sort of done his best to respond to those. So, and obviously any that we haven't, we'll pick up, and then, as I've said, respond to those individuals separately, and then subject to that being okay, is sharing it with a wider group. I think, as Adrian's picked up, he's recording been made available hopefully early next week, so we'll obviously circulate that, and when it's available, and Adrian will circulate as well to his subscribers, no doubt. I think there's just a question from Kevin Miles at Havering around the HMRC form, the requirements for tax deducted from an NDR fund refund interest payments. I appreciate that was a question you raised with us before the meeting, so I think we'll seek comments on that and come back to you. And similarly, a couple of comments on the multiplier, etc. as well. I think Alison has picked up as well, so I can respond to your query, Kevin, around how that works in terms of CT61. So I think they're all the questions that have been in the chat, unless I've missed anything. So I'll now go over to the people that have put their hands up. So first I'll go to Arthur Parker. So if you can switch your camera on and your mic on, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, and this is a question for Mark as well. On, I'm still a little bit confused about the Section 31 grant and its impact on our budget. So apologies if this turns out to be a bit of a silly question, but we started off with the position before the reset of we had obviously had our baseline funding level, our tariff, and then we had some growth, and then we had a significant amount of Section 31 income. As we've gone through the budget process, obviously we stripped out all the growth because, you know, it's a reset. We stripped out from Section 31 income, as you've suggested there, about the Section 31 income relating to under the indexation and the SBRR, etc. And we've now got the baseline funding level, but we've still got some income against our Section 31 income budget for all the other kind of reliefs. Now, if I'm picking this up correctly, it sounds like we might be having some double counting going on, because all those Section 31 release are already taken account, all the remaining ones are already taken account of within the baseline funding level allocations. Is that correct?
I suppose
it's still quite a significant figure for us.
If we narrow this down to kind of business rates, Section 31 grants, rather than kind of big bucket of random stuff that the government fires at us throughout the year.
I'm just talking about the business rates. Aspect.
The line there is you part 1C, which lists all the Section 31 grants, is for information only. All the Section 31 grants that are now driven by the NNDR1 are included in Part 1B, line 14, as a distribution as part of non-domestic rating income. So basically, you've got your business rate, share of business rates, plus your Section 31 grants distributed from the collection fund from Part 1B, line 14. So my big worry, and why I'm really pleased Caroline said this, and I support it absolutely, is councils don't realise that Part 1C is just basically for information, and it's just a split out of the distribution of Section 31 grants that's already in Part 1B, line 14, and your council's budget for it twice. Don't budget for it twice. Only budget for the distribution of Section 31 grants in Part 1B, line 14, I think it is. Plus, if you've got disregard, you've got disregard Section 31 grants at line 17, I think, as well.
So when we're comparing that information from the NNDR1 to the baseline funding level, both of them have in effect got that Section 31 all factored in.
The way that it works is, if you have to compare, if you have to pick up a line on your NNDR1 form to say, what is my business rates baseline? The nearest one you're going to get is Part 1B, line 14. Now, it's not going to be that, your business rates baseline, because your NNDR1 form has growth in. It has, it's affected by unfunded reliefs. And finally, you've got something you're all going to learn and love this phrase: excess retained high value property supplements. Okay, so it's not, but if I had a gun to my head and someone said, point me towards something that's near as damn it your business rates baseline, it's Part 1B, line 14. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're going to need to revisit that then. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that question. Obviously, that just raises issues around make sure you sort of chat with your preceptors around agreeing instalment schedules. Obviously, the sums of money you're likely to be paying over to preceptors will increase as a result of the Section 31 changes. I mean, MHCLG will no doubt pick it up in their instalment schedules, but it's obviously something that needs to be discussed locally around that process to make sure that both parties are very clear in terms of the sort of billing authority preceptor split. So now go on to Matthew from Kensington, Chelsea. So I'm sure you'll, well, you're being asked this at the moment, switch on your camera before you start meetings. So thanks.
Hi. I was going to ask about supporting small business relief. So our councillors are interested in pubs and how much they're going up, and I was going to compare it to hotels and the increase in that. But my understanding is that in 26-27, the previous retail, hospitality and leisure relief is effectively being rolled into the SSBR, irrespective of whether they're small businesses or not. But then in 27-28, it's kind of confusing the way they've written it. As far as I can see, retail, hospitality and leisure is then being moved out, so they can't claim anything. So there's a big jump in what they're paying. But the thing, it also says that in the MHCLG guidance that people who are getting small business rate and rural relief on the 31st of March 26 are also being removed, which to me would mean that there were no qualifying properties anymore for supporting small business relief. So I want to know whether RHL is effectively being removed in 28, that they get like one more year of it, but it's being removed in 27, 28.
Yeah, because I'm not sure if colleagues want to pick up on that, Mark. I mean, clearly, obviously, the intention is that those ratepayers getting RHL relief would basically, their baseline for at least for 26, 27 would be their 25, 26 billion effect after, you know, taking account of the 40% relief. So they're not actually being based on their 25% gross liability for the purpose of transition. Clearly, as you've sort of indicated, and, you know, obviously the government may want to relook at how that all works for 25, 26, so it's for 26, 27, and obviously may consider something longer term for 27, 28, but that's certainly my understanding of how you presented it. But obviously, Chris, if you want to pick up on some of the detail on that, obviously for something that may be changing or at least reviewed over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think obviously with so many changes going on in 26, 27, it's hats off to you for thinking about 27, 28 already. But I think I think the intention is that the SSB scheme provides a kind of ongoing transition. So I'd have thought for 27, 28, the baseline should be the 26, 27 amount. So I'd have thought effectively that would carry on, but I'm happy to sort of take it away and have a look as well in terms of the guidance. But
yeah, at the moment the guidance seems to suggest that it's going to get taken away. But
well, I think the point is it would have been taken away from 25.6 to 6.7, but then I'd have thought the baseline for the 27-28 calculation will be the 26-27 bill, which will have had the transition on it.
Says that, but then says gives a whole list of people who are no longer eligible for it, which includes all those who got RHL on the 31st of March 26.
Yeah, I think it might be as well that they want to look at it, because one of the funny things about SSB is in the past they've always been quite sort of they've been quite definitive about it should be, you know, it's the smaller businesses, the clues in the title, but with bringing the RHL relief into it, that will bring some quite large businesses in scope. So it might be that they're trying to address that on the sort of second year of it.
Yeah, so differentiating in fact between RHL businesses and rural rate relief, and those losing eligibility for small business rate relief will typically be much smaller ratepayers or some sort of small rural pubs or whatever. But I expect, you know, we'll have to sort of wait and see what the government's plans are for 27, 28, and clearly as part of the sort of sweep up for 26, 27 that they'll be looking at in terms of further support for pubs and hospitality sector. I'm assuming they want to give some certainty for ratepayers over the 3-year period. So we'll have to wait and see on the details. And obviously, there's an added complexity for billing authorities in London, including and Chelsea, that there's parallel relief, at least for the Section 47 element of the Small Simple Business Relief Scheme, that does also need to apply to the Elizabeth Line Business Rate Supplement as well. So that is creating some challenges for software providers, but may not be ready in time for initial billing anyway. But that's obviously an added complication for London billing authorities because of the interaction between where Section 47 reliefs apply under the legislation to NNDR, and must also apply to BRS at the same percentage rate. But what is TR? What is Section 47? As a sort of, that's creating a few challenges, but hopefully they'll be resolved as well as part of these wider discussions over the next couple of weeks. So I think that's all we've had in terms of questions on screen. I don't think there's any other further questions in the chat. Obviously, you can pick up sort of some of the other stuff online, as I've indicated, you know, after the meeting by email. And I think, Chris, you've sort of put in a couple of comments about, or a comment about the NNDR1 mapping. I think Carla Maria, you know, as I think you've indicated, you know, as you say, SSB is 3 years for a small business rate relief and rural relief, but the RHL scheme is only a 1-year scheme, just because it obviously potentially affects there is potentially some very large ratepayers benefiting from it. So, but who knows how the government might want to relook at that for certain sectors for 27, 28 as part of the wider support for pubs and hospitality. We'll just sort of wait and see, but that's the current position. So I think unless there's any other questions or anything else anyone else wants to raise, I'd just like to say thank you all for joining the webinar today. So I hope it's been useful in terms of, you know, formulating your ideas for preparing your NNDR1 for 26-27, and associated budget challenges, because we obviously recognise it's quite a difficult time for authorities in terms of all the changes that are happening and the complexity of the changes as well. So we will send out a link to the, or Adrian send out a link to the recording the webinar hopefully early next week, along with the slides. And I'd just like to say thank you all for joining, and we'll hopefully update you on further collection fund webinars over the next few weeks, potentially something in the spring around sort of close down issues, etc. So keep your eyes peeled for that coming through to us as well. So thank you again for joining, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Okay, thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.